We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he felt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Claff. Annie, the day is finally here. The day we have been waiting for all offseason long. It is the all-modern era Orioles fantasy draft. We do one big fantasy draft every offseason. And of course, Annie, we are not just drafting two teams. As you can see, if you are following along with us live on YouTube and Facebook, you can see here our lovely whiteboard has not one, not two, but three names. And today we are joined by former host of the show, good friend of the pod, Mr. Tim Leonard. Hello, Tim.
Wow, what a day it is every year to be with both of you. Just so excited to be here for another fantasy draft. I've poured over my draft boards, and this has become a yearly tradition that I truly, actually, not saying this as a joke, look forward to every year. And I can't wait. This is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, Tim, I know that this is your biggest day of the season. I mean, how is the scouting department feeling? Have you been running the mock drafts? Are you feeling good heading into this all-modern era O's draft?
Well, you know, this one's a little different, Brendan. I think we were talking about this before we truly went live here. The relief pitchers this year, I feel like in previous drafts, I was trying to think, I think this is the fourth one we've done of these.
I think so.
And it's typically like who's going to take the first reliever, and we almost just push the relievers to the end of the draft.
Yeah.
And very interested to see, because we're doing 2010 to present day. If you think about it, the Orioles didn't have a ton of great starting pitchers in that era, but they always had some very good bullpens, especially in the Buck Showalter years. So that's going to be an interesting part of this. I've been running through the simulations with that in mind and trying to really rack my brain as to what you guys are going to do in regards to the pitching this year. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, that will certainly be an interesting aspect of the draft. Annie, I know you've been running some mock drafts as well.
Oh, yeah. I have run some mock drafts. This is my first MASN draft here with you guys, and first piece of content ever with Tim Leonard, so that's exciting as well.
That is exciting stuff.
And look at us, all Syracuse grads as well.
I know. We've kept that tradition running for a while. For a bit, it was myself, Paul, and Tim. Then it was myself, Bones, and Tim. And now we've just got another Syracuse grad here with us.
Yeah, look at us.
That's how these drafts should go. All right, Tim. You mentioned that it is 2010 to present, so let's run over some of the rules for the all-modern era Orioles draft. If you've been with us before for some of these fantasy drafts, you have a pretty good idea of how this works. But for the idea for this draft was that we will only be selecting players that have played under Buck Showalter or Brandon Hyde, the two managers that have really encapsulated the modern era of Orioles baseball. So that is players from 2010 to present. Now, only the players' numbers with the Orioles will count. So, for example, if you are drafting Manny Machado, you will only get his stats with the Orioles. You will not get his stats with the Padres, and other years outside of 2010 to 2024 will not be considered. So you could, in theory, draft somebody like Brian Roberts because he was on that 2010 Orioles team. However, just drafting Brian Roberts because he was on that 2010 team does not mean you get his stats as an Oriole all time. And if you draft Brian Roberts and his, I think, .8 WAR on that 2010 team, and that's all he has from 2010 to 2024, you will be publicly shamed and probably disqualified because you are clearly just trying to pander to the fans. Second rule, longevity does matter. We are looking at a player's Orioles tenure during this time frame, not just their best singular season. There are plenty of guys who didn't have a ton of seasons on this list. They will probably still get drafted, but you have to consider longevity as well. So we will be balancing that throughout this draft. A player that has a few really good seasons, a player that has a bunch of pretty good seasons. How will we value those two guys? And the player that you are selecting must have played the position that you are selecting him for. You could not draft Ryan Mountcastle and put him in center field. The Orioles tried him in the outfield. It didn't work out very well. So you can't draft a player if they have not played that position before. And as you could see here on our lovely whiteboard, we will be drafting 8 position players, 1 designated hitter, 4 starting pitchers, and 2 relievers. And with that, I think we're just about ready to
Do you
get
have the
into the
whiteboard
draft.
markers?
I do have my
Okay,
whiteboard
good.
markers. And if you were following along with our podcast last week, we determined the draft order. It was random. Annie, unfortunately,
It's
with her
rigged.
first draft, gets the unlucky draw
This is the
of the
opposite of
second
beginner's
overall
luck.
pick, which is the hardest pick because you don't get to make back-to-back selections. This is a snake draft. I have the first overall pick, followed by Annie at number 2, which means Tim will have picks 3 and 4, and we will circle back around there. But Annie, I will say, with the number 2 overall pick, I think there are 2 guys at the top of this
Definitely.
draft that are likely to go number 1 and number 2. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. So you will at least get one of those guys, even with the tough number 2
Very
overall
true.
pick.
Very true.
But with that, Tim, are you ready?
Oh, I am as ready as I will ever be. Truly pumped to not have the number 2 pick for once. I think this is the first time I
Yeah.
haven't had the number 2.
You have usually been cursed with that pick, and it's a tough one. But, Annie, I think
I'll prove
you
the
are well
haters
prepared,
wrong.
and the haters will be proven wrong. But with that, I'm on the clock with the number 1 overall pick in our all-modern era Orioles draft. And as I mentioned, I think there are 2 players that were really under consideration, and I think it's no surprise that I can say them out loud. It's Manny Machado and Adam Jones.
Right.
Manny Machado, 860 games in an O's uniform during this time frame, a WAR close to 32. Adam Jones, close to 1,400 games in an Orioles uniform during this time frame. Unfortunately, you don't get his All-Star game in 2009. So this is really where my choice lies between these 2 players. Position-wise, shortstop and center field are both very valuable positions. Manny can play either third or short. Adam Jones either center or right. There wasn't a ton separating these 2 guys, but there was one thing, and that's going to make my decision here. I'm going to go with Manny Machado.
Okay.
For my first overall selection here. Did play in about 500 fewer games than Adam Jones, and I know longevity does matter, but Manny puts up a better WAR during that time frame and just had some better individual seasons. Adam Jones with 3 finishes inside the top 20 in MVP voting. Manny Machado with 3 top 20 finishes as well, but 2 of those were within the top 5. He finishes in 4th in 2015 and 5th in 2016. He's got 4 All-Star games in 2013, 2015, 2016, 2018. So because of how great those seasons were individually, I know he doesn't have as many games under his belt as Adam Jones, but some great individual seasons makes Manny Machado my first overall pick here.
Okay. That works because there was nothing really else I could do to prepare for my first pick because it was kind of just going to be whoever Brendan does not pick between those 2 guys. So with no surprise, I'm going to take Adam Jones as my center fielder, 2010 to 2018 for those years since 2010. The second highest WAR of all the options that we're looking at in the Buck and Hyde eras. So 27.9 WAR. He played 1,300 more than 1,300 games and 5,400 at bats. A 280, 318, 464, and 782 OPS /line. And 4 straight All-Stars from 2012 to 2015. Top 15 MVP placed on the placing list from 2012 to 2014. Gold Glove from 2012 to 2014. And Silver Slugger in 2013. The list of kind of acknowledgments goes on for Adam Jones, and you kind of look at what he's done for this club and the Baltimore community. So that's an easy pick for me once you've taken Manny Machado.
Yeah, Adam Jones, recent Baltimore front office hire as well. Hired as an advisor to Mike Elias. So I think these were the 2 slam dunk number 1 and number 2 picks. Manny Machado slots in as my third baseman. Adam Jones as your center fielder. Tim, you're on the clock with the third pick. I think there's probably no surprise that these 2 guys are off the board.
No, not at all. I think, honestly, from here, and I'll be interested how we draft from here. I don't want to give away all my cards, but I feel like 3 through about 8 maybe are kind of in a different tier, kind of grouped together. So for me, I'm just trying to pick the 2 best players out of that next group. And then hopefully, I maybe can snag one of those when it comes back around to me. So there are a lot of different options here, and I could go many different ways. But I'm going to shore up my shortstop position, get a premium position, and get my guy Gunnar Henderson, who, of course, longevity is into the consideration here. So everyone's probably thinking, oh, that's an obvious selection. Why didn't Gunnar go earlier maybe? But we're factoring in what is your overall tenure and how much really have you accumulated overall WAR for the Orioles. So Gunnar is not an obvious selection when you consider that, but I think you have to weigh, the peak of his powers and what he has brought to the team since he's come up in a short amount of time. He had literally a 9-WAR season last year, one of the best seasons in Orioles history. And actually on a per 162 game basis, he has a higher average WAR right now than Manny Machado did in his time with the Orioles that we're factoring in. So about a 7.7 WAR per 162 for Gunnar Henderson. So I don't know if that surprises you guys at all. I just think he's a little bit of, social media pandering maybe, but he also is Gunnar Henderson, and you can't really let him slip down the board too much.
Yeah, that wasn't a surprising pick for me, Tim. I had Gunnar Henderson as my third-ranked player on my board as well. It's one of the best seasons in Orioles history last year. As you mentioned, it's over 9 WAR. And no matter how you slice it, I know it's only 343 career games in an Orioles uniform, but he has already accumulated over 16 career WAR, which is a great career for a lot of guys. So that's not shocking to me at all. I think that's a good pick.
Me too.
So then for my next pick, I am weighing 2 catchers here, which I think if you're an Orioles fan, it's pretty obvious what I am weighing. They are 2 former number 1 overall draft picks. And, you can call this social media pandering, but I've just got to pair Gunnar and Adley together.
Sure.
I've got to do it.
Sure.
It's too tempting if you give me the 3rd and 4th pick. So I know that their longevity is not as strong as a guy like Matt Wieters, who is obviously the other catcher that I'm weighing here. There are a lot of great players to choose from. But, it's the modern-day Orioles draft, and I get a chance to put Gunnar and Adley at 2 premium positions. We know they have great chemistry together as well. So my team locker room is already off to a great start chemistry-wise. And, Adley is young in his career at this point, and it's still, time will tell if he'll get to the same amount of WAR or pass the guys that we've already taken in this draft and get to the levels of like Machado or Adam Jones. I think we all agree he probably will, and he's obviously a great clubhouse guy, makes every pitcher better with his defense at catcher. So I am going Gunnar and Adley. I'm figuring that was what you were guessing, Brendan. When you texted me, I think I know what you're going to do with the 3rd and 4th pick.
Yeah, I was about to say, Tim, I texted you earlier in the week and said, man, I know what you're going to do with 3 and 4, and it's really going to bug me because I think these were the 2 correct picks there. And, Adley and Matt Wieters, as you mentioned, kind of a toss-up. Wieters with slightly more WAR, more games played, but I think the separator there is that Adley has 2 top 20 MVP finishes. Matt Wieters never really reached that peak. And pairing Gunnar and Adley together, it's a nice way to start.
Well, I guess with that, not yet another decision that hasn't been too difficult because of my 2 people that have gone before me. So with that, I'm going to go Matt Wieters because if I don't, then I am kind of screwed with catcher position.
Yeah, you're not getting the catcher if you don't go Matt Wieters here.
Matt Wieters, like you mentioned, a 16.8 WAR between the years of 2010 2016, 786 games, and over 3,000 at-bats. 737 OPS, another switch hitter, so kind of like Adley there. But you mentioned not really any top MVP choices there, but still a 4-time All-Star with the O's, 2-time Gold Glover, and 4 seasons in the top 4 for assists as catcher and caught stealing as catcher. And then 3 seasons in top 4 for fielding percentage as a catcher. So I think this is also a no-brainer. I haven't really had to do too much thinking for my top 2 choices.
No, I think that pick makes a lot of sense because if you did not select Matt Wieters, I was surely going to select Matt Wieters. So I think that's a good pick there. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm going to have to wait a while for a catcher because there's not another catcher with Adley and Matt Wieters that really lines up with those 2 guys. I think so far the board is shaking out kind of how I anticipated. Manny Machado with the 1st overall pick, followed by Adam Jones. You pair Jones with Matt Wieters, and then Tim has the dynamic duo of Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman. But guys, you've left me with a really fun hypothetical, which I was hoping would happen. Adley and Wieters are off the board. I knew I wasn't going to get Gunnar or Adam Jones. But I have the chance to make a heck of an infield here with a couple of guys that played together. And Tim, you mentioned the chemistry between Adley Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson and how that might benefit the clubhouse a little bit. How about Manny Machado's best friend on those Orioles teams with Jonathan Scope? And then how about just a heck of a double play combo with Jonathan Scope and J. Hardy? And
See,
that's
this
a
is
heck
where
of an
picking-
infield with me with back-to-back picks.
This is where picking back-to-back would be really
Back-to-back,
benefit.
it's a nice benefit. So I'm going to shore up my infield here. I'm going to take J.J. Hardy as my shortstop, who fantastic defensively. I know the offensive numbers weren't there as much, but 3 Gold Gloves for J.J. Hardy, was an all-star in 2013. And then Jonathan Scope, over 15 career WAR, 747 OPS, 106 home runs in an Orioles uniform, made that all-star game in 2017, had a 12th place MVP finish as well. Guys, I'm feeling really good about my infield right now with Manny at third base, J.J. Hardy at shortstop, Jonathan Scope at second base.
See, this has become quite the pickle for me because this is where it kind of starts to get thin once you get all these guys off the board already. So, but now I have to decide what I want to do, whether I want to go best player available that's left and even go into the arms or go into my infield as well. So I'm going to go with so you have J.J. Hardy and Jonathan Scope. Okay, I'm going to go with.
Big decision here for Annie.
This is a really big decision because
there are a lot of good players on the board, but Tim, I think your point before was right, where the first 6-7 picks, it felt like there was an order that they would go, and now you have to start to wonder, okay, do we go arms? Do we go, somebody with a few spectacular seasons? There's a lot of options here, Tim.
Yeah,
the pitching, I'm just waiting for someone to grab a pitcher because then that'll start the chain reaction usually.
Yep. All right, Annie, where do you think you're going to go here with your pick? There's a lot of options that you're mulling.
There are a lot of options.
The gears are turning. We see it, Annie.
You guys keep discussing how much time do I have.
We're going to put you on the clock here pretty soon.
All right. I'm going to go.
Mulling over the whiteboard here.
Yeah, I am actually mulling over the whiteboard. You know what? I'm going to go with right fielder Nick Markakis, 2010, 2014. War of 9, just because I think once you start with the outfielders, it gets a little bit tricky of who you put into left field, center field, right field, and I already have a center fielder, so to pair Adam Jones with Nick Markakis seems like a really, really good decision as well. He had a Gold Glove in 2011 and 2014 and O's Hall of Famer this past season. So I think that Nick Markakis, Adam Jones, to kind of start to round out my outfield seems like a really good idea.
Yeah.
A 258 batting average with 8 hits and 1 home run, 3 RBIs in 7 games in that 2014 postseason run is also a good key for me to pick.
Nick Markakis, I mean, certainly was an excellent player in an Orioles uniform. My question mark with Markakis there is just that you don't get the spectacular season in 2008, where he has 7.5 WAR. So it is not the Nick Markakis that accumulated a ton of WAR between 2006 and 2009, where he put up 17 WAR. It is the Nick Markakis from 2010 on, who only accumulates 9 WAR in an Orioles uniform. So you don't get the peak of Nick Markakis' power, but of course Markakis, an excellent name, and it definitely shores up right field. Tim, I think this leaves you in an interesting spot. I didn't have Markakis as high on my board, just because, as I mentioned, you don't get a few of the spectacular seasons before there, but I think Annie gets some good name value there, Tim.
Yeah, I think that's the important point, because a lot of people are probably thinking that haven't followed along with these drafts, why is Nick Markakis still available? But you made the right point there. 9 WAR is still phenomenal. I mean, he was a very good player over this time period. So I think it's really fascinating, actually, how I feel like we're picking all of our teams are like teammates of one another, is how this is trending.
Chemistry.
This is only a hypothetical team, but all of our hypothetical team chemistries are outstanding.
Yeah, and it's like we're each developing an era. Like, you guys are going more from the 2010, like, Buck era.
Yeah.
And I think I just got to stay on the theme of the Brandon Hyde era, I guess, here, because I want to make sure I sort of lock down. I'm trying to get the key positions here, the middle of the field. Mike Elias, he likes to draft up the middle. I like to draft up the middle as well. And I'm going to go with center fielder Cedric Mullins as my next pick, because he was basically the heir apparent to Adam Jones. And there's not a ton of options at center field I found deep down my draft board. So similar thinking to how Brendan now is left with a catcher that he's going to have to wait on. I just want to lock up that center field position. Obviously, Mullins when he went to a full-time switch hitting and had that great 30-30 season. That accumulates a lot of his WAR, but I think it's honestly sneaky. I mean, even since then, since 2021, he's had 3.8 WAR per season. So he still had 32 stolen bases last year, 18 home runs. He was up and down. Yes, it's easier to steal bases now with the bigger bases. But, I think continuing the chemistry, continuing all guys that have played together, I think Cedric Mullins is too tempting right now.
Yeah, obviously the 30-30 season in 2021 is what jumps out about Cedric Mullins, but you're right, Tim. I mean, even the seasons outside of that, he still accumulated 15 WAR in his Orioles career. This is still a consistently good player, even in the seasons where he's not going 30-30.
I'm going to
Exactly. And now go ahead, Annie.
No.
I'm so excited for my next pick. I'm jumping the gun.
Oh, you still had a second pick. That's right. I was going to
Annie's ready to jump the gun there. You better jump in before she steals your selection here, Tim.
At least I'm trying to make sense of the snake. All I know is every time I pick, I think I go back to back.
Whenever you pick, you're picking again.
That was my fault.
Yeah. So my next pick, I am going to go away from all teammates and the chemistry here in the Brandon Hyde era.
Ooh.
I'm going to go for maybe kind of a controversial name. And I want to stand up for this guy. It's our guy, Chris Davis, who, of course, petered out. And we all know about the story of Chris Davis. But I think when you go through an exercise like this, you gain more appreciation for just how valuable of a player he was and how dominant his peaks were. And I'm probably going to put him at first base for now. Brendan is going to be my move. But, Chris Davis, we know about his career. We know it got ugly there towards the end, and his contract wasn't the best. But you just look at what he did in 2013, led all of Major League Baseball on pretty much every hitting stat that year, 7.1 WAR. He still has a 12.1 WAR overall in Baseball Reference for the time period we're looking at here. He was an Oriole for 10 seasons, very valuable player throughout the postseason runs there of the Buck era. So I want to give some love to Chris Davis. I didn't want him to slide too far down this board because we know that there's kind of two different eras of the Chris Davis experience, but I think still looking at his career totality, he deserves a lot of flowers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a third-place MVP finish in 2013 where he led Major League Baseball in home runs with 53. Chris Davis, at the peak of his power, was an excellent, excellent player. And again, obviously there were the struggles towards the end of his career. But I think we have seen, especially here at Camden Yards, when Chris Davis has been back for things like the Nick Markakis Hall of Fame induction, the fans appreciate what Chris Davis has done in an Orioles uniform because Chris Davis, at his best, was one of the best players in baseball. And I think that's a good pick there, Tim. All right, real quick, Annie, before we get to your pick, let's run through the teams here a little bit as we have made our first few selections. Tim, you just selected Chris Davis. Give us the rest of the squad.
So I started with Gunnar Henderson at shortstop for now, and then I got Adley Rutschman, his good pal, at the catcher position. Those were picks 3 and 4 of the draft, and then I just went Cedric Mullins, followed by Chris Davis. So I've got 3 players from the Hyde era, and then Chris Davis at first base right now.
Yeah, I've got Jonathan Scope at second base, Manny Machado at third base, J.J. Hardy at shortstop. I am shoring up that mid to late 2010s infield there. Annie, you've made 3 selections as well. Give us your team and then give us your pick.
I have Matt Wieters as catcher, Adam Jones at center field, and Nick Markakis at right field. And then for my next pick, I need to get some infielders right now. So I'm going to go with Trey Mancini at first base.
Okay.
At 10.2 WAR, 701 games in an Oriole uniform, a 797 OPS, ranked third as AL Rookie of the Year in that 2017 year in his rookie season. And I think that just all around, you could have put Trey Mancini in a few positions here, but I think that to settle off my first baseman, I think that Trey Mancini is a really good pick, especially what he's given to this team and community at the same time. I was toying a little bit about using him as a DH because I think the DH is a little bit thin comparatively to other positions, but I think I like him at first base.
Yeah, I look, Andy, you've got some fan favorites on this team. Trey Mancini, Adam Jones, Nick Markakis. You might have the fan favorite team here with those names. Trey Mancini, an excellent Orioles career. Again, Trey Mancini at the peak of his powers, that's a really good player there. So I think that's a good pick. And I'm not accusing you guys of colluding at all. All I'm saying is that you two have both drafted catchers. You have both drafted first basemen. You have both drafted center fielders. And I am going to be waiting a while before I take those positions.
Sounds like you're just late to the punch.
I think I am.
Here.
I think I am. Or I might just be early to the second base punch and early to the third base punch. But, however you want to frame it.
Who's going to be early to the arm punch? That's the question.
I think it's going to be me.
It's going to be you.
I think it's going to be me because I am in a really, really interesting spot here where there aren't a ton of position players that I'm looking at and saying, man, I need that guy on my team. But there are a few relievers. And I could draft two of them if I really wanted to get fancy with it. But I think I'm just going to go one here. And there are two guys at the top of the reliever list that obviously stand out. Zach Britton, Darren O'Day. There's not a lot of separating those two guys, but I do think there is one key factor, and that is why I'm going to go with Zach Britton as my first reliever. And the one thing that stands out is that 2016 season, a .54 ERA. Two-time All-Star in 2015 and 2016, but that 2016 season, fourth place finish in the AL Cy Young voting. That season was just absolutely ridiculous. So Zach Britton, the first arm off the board as my first reliever here with my first pick.
I think that 2016 season is really kind of the common denominator between those guys because with Zach Britton and Darren O'Day, you have two very dominant relievers. And like Tim mentioned at the beginning, the reliever board is pretty strong for this era. But Zach Britton definitely stands out. 100% save percentage in that 2016 season is
ridiculous.
Unreal.
Ridiculous season from Zach Britton. So if I wanted to, I could go Darren O'Day here as well and just have a bullpen of death. I don't think I'm going to do it. And the reason why is because if I don't select this player, I'm afraid he's going to fall to Tim. And then Tim is just going to have the greatest 2020 and on team that you could possibly have. So with my next selection here, I'm going to go with Anthony Santander. Career year last year for Santander, makes the All-Star game with 44 home runs, over an 11 career WAR in an Orioles uniform. His story is incredible. Former Rule 5 draft pick, and he was a real diamond in the rough that the Orioles were able to find during their rebuild. And Santander carved out a really, really nice Orioles career. So I'm going to select Anthony Santander, and he is going to be my right fielder.
Okay. So you're picking him at right field. Okay, so I think my next one is going to be a designated hitter. This one might seem, with other guys still on the board, it might seem a little bit out of left field.
Ooh.
But someone who only played one season with the Orioles, that's 2014, Nelson Cruz
Whoa.
as my designated hitter.
Wow.
One season of 4.5 WAR for that 1 year, an 859 OPS, 40 home runs, and 108 RBIs.
Yeah.
He also batted .357 with 10 hits and 2 home runs in 7 games in that 2014 postseason run. All-Star in that 1 year that he played with the O's and led MLB in home runs that year and finished 7th in MVP voting that 2014 as well. So I'm going to go with him as my DH.
Wow. I mean, that's a bit of a surprising pick for me. I had him a little bit lower down my boards. This is really what we were talking about coming into the draft, where we were saying you have to balance somebody's longevity versus their best season. And Nelson Cruz's best season in an Orioles uniform, it was only one season in an Orioles uniform, but it was a gosh darn good season. So if you're looking at just, hey, what's the best season here? Nelson Cruz is a really good pick. Goes a little bit against the grain with what we were talking about with the longevity, but I mean, you can't argue with the production that you got from Nelson Cruz. Tim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I kind of like how Annie's going about this because I feel like, Brendan, you and I are very concentrated on the WAR and like the overall WAR, and that frames our draft boards a lot. But look, Nelson Cruz, it was just 1 year, but it was a really valuable year, of course. And I mean, the home run he hit in the postseason in Detroit in Game 3, like he had some huge moments in an Orioles uniform, despite it being just 1 year. So I think we probably weren't going to take him for a little bit. So you could argue that you could have waited. And I think that's just the benefit of you and I have done these drafts with one another for a while. So we kind of know each other's tendencies. But yeah, I still think it's a worthy pick here. And if anything, underrated just how good that season was for Nelson Cruz.
All right, Annie goes with Nelson Cruz. Tim, you are back on the clock with 2 picks.
Yes, lots of options here. And, you brought up earlier how Annie is kind of scooping up the fan favorites right now. And I want to make sure I get this fan favorite before he slips down the board too much further. And that is Darren O'Day, a name you brought up as one of the top 2 relievers right next to Zach Britton. There are a lot of strong relievers. We're going into the bullpen quicker than previous fantasy drafts we've done here. And Darren O'Day, of course, the chance that the fans gave him, had a really, really productive stretch there with the kind of postseason teams that Buck Showalter had. 2015, he was an all-star. He actually had a 2.72 ERA plus that year. So 100 is league average. Bullpen guys kind of benefit from that number. But overall, his ERA in 2015 was a 1.52. Remember, he was a guy who was a waiver claim. And I think that added to him being kind of a fan favorite. Really had a nice, long, successful career. About 11 WAR overall for the time period we're looking at. So I'm going to get my closer, Darren O'Day.
Yeah, I think that's the pick there. Darren O'Day was the last player that I had in my kind of second tier of players that I was looking at as drafting. And Darren O'Day, as you mentioned, Tim, just a really fantastic Orioles career. It's funny that spectacular Zach Britton stretch comes in 2015, 2016, because that's when Darren O'Day was at the peak of his powers as well. So that was a really excellent Orioles 1-2 punch during that era. All right, Tim, you've got one more.
They had some great bullpens for sure. So you said it well there, Brendan. Now we're into almost a different tier in my eyes, and it's tough. We have not drafted any starting pitchers yet.
Nope.
And that's because there aren't a ton of great options, if we're being honest. And also there's not a ton of separating. Like I feel like there's maybe 4 or 5 starting pitchers that you can make a case for as maybe the first or second to come off the board. So with that in mind, I'm actually not going to go into the starting pitching well yet. I'm going to go for a position that I feel like there's more of a drop-off if I don't take this player now. And I have 2 picks, and then it's a long time before it comes back around to me. So I want to make sure I kind of shore up my infield a little bit here and get another guy from the Brandon Hyde era. That's Ramon Arias, who was a Gold Glove in 2022. I'm going to put him at second base. I think second base is a little bit thin. So I want to make sure that I have a solid second baseman there. I'll pair him with Gunnar in my middle infield. They have some chemistry together. Arias had a great 2022 season, 3.8 WAR that year. He was a solid 1.5 WAR last year. So in 5 seasons with the Orioles, he's racked up a 9.1 overall WAR. And I think there are better players available, but I'm drafting for need here a little bit and try to make sure I get second base looking pretty good.
Yeah, Ramon Arias, an incredibly sneaky 9 career WAR player. I mean, that's a lot of good seasons from Ramon Arias. There's not one elite season that jumps out. I suppose you could look back to the Gold Glove season where he was a mainstay at third base, wins that Gold Glove in 2022. So Ramon Arias, maybe you don't look at as a player that had, an outstanding season where he makes an all-star team, but it's just a lot of good seasons from Ramon Arias stacked up.
Especially this past season, he kept the Orioles afloat for a big chunk of it when the offense was slumping. Okay, now that you guys have both picked second baseman, I'm going to hold off on that for now. But I am going to go to third base. I'm going to wait for the pitchers again. But for third base, I'm going to take Jordan Westberg, bring some recent guys into my lineup. But Jordan Westberg, only a 3.7 WAR, but he has been one of the best clutch hitters since he came up to this Orioles squad since 2023. Only 2 seasons, but I still think that there's going to be a lot more to come from him. Definitely could see how much the O's were struggling without him when he fell to injury this season. But just an all-around clutch hitter guy, 767 OPS, really good against lefties, and that's what the Orioles were missing this year.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you mentioned it. You and I are a little bit by the book with our, cumulative WAR, and we're looking at longevity. Annie is kind of crushing it with the just really good seasons here and there. I mean, Nelson Cruz.
He's going for all-stars.
Yeah. Nelson Cruz with that spectacular 2014 season where he makes the All-Star game. Jordan Westberg with an outstanding season last year where he makes the All-Star game. She's stacking up All-Star games here, Tim.
Yeah, she must be eyeing Corbin Burns. That might be her next pick, honestly, the way things are trending. So it's a different strategy. I think, you can make a case for both, honestly. It's kind of fun to see that we're shaping the teams differently.
Yeah, certainly. And it leaves me in an interesting spot. I thought that one of you guys was going to draft a starting pitcher. And Tim, I'm with you. There's nobody that really separates themselves for me. I'm in an interesting spot because there are two players that I could select that you guys already have that position filled. So do I go, okay, maybe they won't draft them and won't move them around to different places, or do I run that risk and run the risk of you guys moving them to a different spot and me missing out on two positions that I really need? Because there's not a starting pitcher that really separates themselves from me, I think I'm just going to keep going position player. And I'm going to make sure that I get the two guys that I have in kind of my third tier of players who just racked up a lot of really good seasons and are at two positions of need for me. And that's going to be at first base, Ryan Mountcastle, and at center field, Austin Hayes. Two guys in the Brandon Hyde era. Austin Hayes, will make him my first selection here. Close to a 10 WAR, had an all-star season in 2023. When Austin Hayes was healthy, Austin Hayes was an outstanding player. And I think he slots perfectly into my center field spot here, has his teammate in Anthony Santander as his outfield mate. And then I feel really good about my infield. I know you guys took two catchers early, but Ryan Mountcastle, Jonathan Scope, Manny Machado, J.J. Hardy, I think that's a pretty solid infield there, guys, and I feel pretty good about how my position players are looking. I know that there's a pretty good chance that after I make these two selections, starting pitchers come flying off the board, and I won't have one of those top few guys, but I think I'm going to go position player heavy and make sure I lock up my first base and center field spots with Mountie and Austin Hayes.
Yeah, starting pitchers they're honestly like the relief pitchers of previous drafts. I think we're all just waiting for that first one to come off the board, because you're right. There's honestly 4 or 5 that I'm looking at that I could make a case for being the first starting pitcher off the board. So I think similar thinking to my pick, Brennan, that's the right pick here. I feel like position players might continue to go off the board, but we'll see. I'm sure one of us will draft a starter sooner rather than later.
One of us is going to have to draft a starting pitcher. That is quite literally the rule of the game. And honestly, there are starting pitchers that were higher on my board than Austin Hayes and Ryan Mountcastle. It's not like there has been no starting pitching talent on this team for the last 2 managers as we are drafting players from 2010 to 2024. The starting pitching talent has been there. There are guys with spectacular individual seasons. There are guys that have racked up just a bunch of pretty good seasons as well, but there are just a bunch of guys in that group, and it's interesting that none of us have wanted to pull the trigger on being the first one to really separate those guys and say, hey, this is the first pitcher that deserves to be off the board. Seems like we are all in that same line of thinking where it's, hey, let's get the positions where there is some more separation versus the starting pitchers where there just aren't that many guys that separate themselves from that group. But I think those are going to be the last picks of the day here on this episode of The Bird's Nest. Real quick before we get out of here, let's run through our teams as we have each made a bunch of selections. Tim, we'll start with you.
All right, so my first pick was the 3rd overall pick of the draft. I went with Gunnar Henderson, who has had the best individual season of any of these players. Adley Rutschman was my second pick, 4th overall pick in the draft at catcher. So Gunnar and Adley, the dynamic duo. Then I went with Cedric Mullins in center field. Also grabbed Chris Davis at first base. I also have Darren O'Day as my closer and my top reliever, and Ramon Arias is currently my second baseman. So I've got a lot of the Brandon Hyde era right now mixed with Chris Davis and Darren O'Day.
Yeah, we're drafting a lot of Buck and Brandon Hyde guys. That was the parameters of this draft. If you played under Buck or Brandon, you are eligible to be selected. And I think Tim just heard the Brandon part of that because he is selecting a lot of players that played with Brandon Hyde. Annie, you haven't selected a single pitcher, reliever or starter.
No, I have not.
But you drafted a lot of good position players. Tell us about your team.
Okay, so I have Matt Wieters at catcher, Trey Mancini at first base, Jordan Westberg at third, Adam Jones at center field, Nick Markakis in right field, and Nelson Cruz with the surprise of the board at DH.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, you're going for a lot of guys that had great individual seasons, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how the fans react to that strategy of, okay, do we want the team with more longevity, or do we see a guy like Nelson Cruz on your roster and go, man, that was a great individual season there? So we'll see how the fans vote. It's going to be interesting. And then my team, I started off the draft with the first overall pick with Manny Machado. The draft came back around to me, and I grabbed Jonathan Scope and J.J. Hardy to fill out that late 2010s infield. And I kept going position players. Ryan Mountcastle at first base, Austin Hayes in center field, Anthony Santander in right. And I was the first one to draft a pitcher with Zach Britton as my primary reliever. But we are far from done with this all-modern era Orioles draft. Make sure you tune in again next week as we fill out our teams. This is where the teams are made here. Who is going to draft a starting pitcher? Who will separate themselves later in the draft? This is where the good drafters really separate themselves here. So we're going to see how the second half of this draft shakes out. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes for producing this one. Huge thank you to Tim Leonard for joining us here today. Hopefully you joined us live on YouTube and Facebook, as we are live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on those two platforms, or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest. Make sure you tune in next week, part 2 of the all-modern era Orioles draft. For Andy Claff and Tim Leonard, I'm Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.